Welcome back, part 2, Appendix C. Again, back of your textbook, not in the back of any particular chapter, certainly not in the back of chapter 10. So turn to the end of your textbook and you want to find Appendix C. In chapter 10, we studied bonds. As a review, bonds are issued at face value, at discount, or premium. The bond selling price changes depending on what's going on in the market. Now remember, if a company needs money and they choose to use bonds as their form of financing, they create a contract, a bond indenture. They decide what the total issuance of the bonds are going to be, $5 million. Now remember, if you sell $5 million worth of bonds at face value is always $1,000, and that would mean you were selling 5,000 bonds. If we sell the bonds at face value, that means that on the selling day, the market interest rate is equal to the bond contract rate. And the bond contract rate is also a percentage, and it is the interest percent that will be paid on the bonds every year or semi-annually, twice a year. And it's a locked-in rate. The company can't change it. But the market is fluctuating all the time. And so if the market and the bond rate are exactly the same, then there's no difference and the bonds will be sold at face value. Realistically, the market is fluctuating all the time. And so if the market rate goes up, let's say the bond is selling at 8% and the market goes to 10%, well, everyone's going to want to buy the other bonds that are being traded. They're not going to buy the company's bonds. And so to entice the buyer, the selling company with the lower rate discounts their bonds. They sell them less than the market rate. They sell them less than face value, sorry. So it may have, if face value is $1,000, they might sell them for $900. And that's a way to adjust to the market rate. They will still pay interest on $1,000 at the contract rate. What if so in a discounted amount, the market interest rate is more attractive and the bond rate is not attractive. I would say, in my language, I would say the company has an ugly bond, so to entice you to buy it, they put it on sale. The opposite could be true. The market rate could have dropped, could have gone down, in which case the bond contract rate, again, we cannot change that rate, so the company bond is more attractive. So we mark it up. Now, how do we set the selling price of bonds? We do it using present value. So how do we calculate that? First off, when you're given one of these problems, you need to clearly identify all of the elements that you need to do to solve the problem. So first thing is, what is the bond interest rate? What is the contract rate? Now, we have two interest rates floating around. We have the contract rate and the market interest rate. And the bond interest rate is only used to calculate the bond interest payment amount. So if the bonds are trading, if the bond was sold at face value, $1,000, and the interest rate is 9%, well, once a year you would pay the bondholders $90, or twice a year you'd pay them $45 each. What if the bond's sold at discount? You still will pay the bondholder the same amount, $90 a year or $45 two times a year. So you are locked into that. You also need to know on these problems the face value of the bond issuance. So if I said to you, we issued 30 bonds, the face value of the bond issuance would be $30,000. And that's the $1,000 face value times the number of bonds sold. You need to calculate the bond interest payment. So again, you'd take that contract rate, whatever it is, 9%, and multiply it by the face value of the bond issuance. So every 6 months or every year, you're going to pay $90 a bond. If you sold 30 bonds, you're going to quickly do the calculation. 30 bonds times 90, you're going to have interest payments out of $2,700. Okay. Market interest rate, That's the rate you're going to use to discount the bonds. That's the rate you're going to use to calculate the present value of the bonds, either at discount or at premium. Okay, let's say you have 100 bonds. Quick review, what's the face value of a single bond? Not the whole bond issuance, but a single bond. I hope you didn't have to calculate that. It's $1,000. What is the face value of the entire bond issuance? 100 times 1,000 is going to equal $100,000. So that's the face value of the bond issuance. All right, bond interest rate. Let's use 10%. Face value of the bond, 100,000. And your bond interest payments now, you're doing this twice a year. It's a semi-annual bond. And that's going to be your annual rate divided by 2. So 100,000 times 10% divided by 2 is 10,000 divided by 2 is 5,000. Your years are 5 years. Okay. Bond interest rate 10%, face value of the bond issuance 100,000, bond interest payments 5,000, years 5. There are 2 cash outflows with bonds. One is the company has to pay $5,000 every 6 months. That's a repeated amount. We would say that's an annuity every 6 months for 5 years, 10 total payments. The second amount is the principal that we have to pay off at the end of the life of the bond of $100,000. You have to, in order to calculate the bond selling price, you have to calculate the present value of each of these cash flows. You add them together and that gives you the selling price of the bond. Okay, so let's first talk about the interest payment let's first talk about the 5 years. The company has to pay back the bond at face value in 5 years. Now, because we're paying interest twice a year, we have to break up the number of periods. So even though it's 5 years, because we're paying interest every 6 months, that's 10 periods. And we need to know that because that's the N we're going to use in the present value problem. And again, it doesn't matter what the selling price was for this bond. This is what we are obligated to pay back at the end of 5 years at the end of these 10 periods. Let's look at the second cash flow. This is the $5,000 every 6 months for 10 periods. 5,000 is an annuity. The principal was a single amount, but this amount is an annuity. And again, it doesn't change. We are locked into this, and this 5,000 is calculated on face value, not on selling price. So we have 2 cash flows here. Now the question is, and we're going to walk through calculating the bond selling price at face value, discount, and premium. So you need to be able to calculate the bond selling price when the market is different. But let's start by proving that this same calculation works no matter what is going on in the market. So in my first example, it's at face value. So the first timeline is for the principal, the second timeline is for the annuity. All right, now let me demonstrate this for you. So when you look up, the first line is for a single amount, so we're going to use table 3. We're going to use as our interest rate 5%. We took that 10% and divided it by 2 because we're paying interest twice a year. And your number of periods is 10. So you're going to go to table 3, look for the intersection of 10 periods at 5%, and your factor is 61391. 0.61391. You're going to multiply that by your principal and you're going to get it discounted to $61,391. That's just one piece of how we calculate this. Now you're going to look at the $5,000. You're going to flip over to table 4. You're going to look at the intersection of 5%, 10 years, and you're going to find your factor, 7.72173. Multiply that by your 5,000 and you get 38,609. We'll add those two cash flows together and you'll see that it adds up to $100,000. So when we sell at face value, if we were to do these same calculations, they actually prove out, yes, it's face value. And remember, in bond speak, we don't say, well, we're selling them at 100%. We just say we're selling these bonds at 100. All right, but that's not what usually happens. So let's do one at discount. The company's bond rate is 10%. The market is up, it's 12%. So when the market goes up, bond prices go down. So let's do the calculations. All that's going to change here is our factor. And the factor is going to change because we changed the interest rate. Now, the market is 12%. Divided by 2 is 6%. That will change our factor. So we'll go to a different column and we'll get 55839. We'll get on table 3. On table 4, we'll get a factor of 736009. Multiply that by our principal, and you get 55,839. Multiply the 7.36009 times 5,000, and you get 36,800. Add them together, you get 92,639. That will be our selling price for this bond. So we would say we're issuing 100,000 bonds at 92.639, and the percentage is implied. So we're going to collect less than the face value when we sell this bond, and this is how we calculated that rate. All right, this is my personal favorite. We get to sell a bond at premium. So the market, we're selling at 10%. I'm using the same contract rate for all these examples, but the market's only 8%. You're going to sell the bond at premium. So again, the 8% causes our interest rate to change. We use half. We still use table 3, but our factor now changes. So we get 0.67556 times 100,000 equals 67,556. We multiply the 5,000 by the new factor of 8.11090, and we get $40,555. Adding these two together, you get 108,111. And that will be our selling price for this bond. So we have an issue price of 108.111. So we're selling $100,000 worth of bonds at 108.111, greater than 100%. All right, for your homework, you are responsible for the exam, you are responsible for pages C1 to C14. You are not responsible to use financial calculators. I would just as soon you learn Excel if you're going to go that route. And then that ends Appendix C, Part 2. Goodbye and good luck.